I'm Jill Tolles, Executive Director of the Guinn Center for Policy Priorities. We are an independent, statewide, nonpartisan policy research center for the state of Nevada. What makes an effective lawmaker? At the third annual Gallagher Dialogues, we tried to answer that question. The dialogues, held in February at the Nevada Museum of Art, focused on effective lawmaking. We invited Craig Volden and Alan Wiseman, the founders and co-directors of the Center for Effective Lawmaking out of Vanderbilt and the University of Virginia, to tell us how they developed their methods for evaluating lawmakers and what they've learned after years of researching the United States Congress and state legislatures.
About 20 years ago, Craig and I started a research collaboration in which we were really trying to understand at the most fundamental level, why are some, in our case, members of Congress, more effective lawmakers than others? But that, of course, raised a question, how do we even know whether or not someone's effective? What does it mean? People have their own conceptions of this. So we started developing a pretty in-depth measurement exercise and research exercise to try to identify which members of Congress are the most effective lawmakers and start to understand and identify certain patterns in the data regarding individuals' personal circumstances or the strategies they employed or the times they were living in. For example, we were able to demonstrate that members of Congress that engage in bipartisan lawmaking or bipartisan collaboration, controlling for other things, are more effective lawmakers than others. We were able to show under certain circumstances how female members of Congress were notably more effective lawmakers than male members of Congress. And thanks for the smile there, by the way.
As a member of the first female majority in United States history back in 2000.
I would have expected someone to have given a shout out at some point. So from our perspective, a lot of our findings resonated with us and the broader academic community. But as we started to do more and more academic research, we realized that we were able to provide robust, large sample, empirical, data-driven guidance, both to citizens and legislators and their staffs about what factors contribute to or perhaps detract from the ability of legislators to advance their agendas.
Start out by thinking that we're the Center for Effective Lawmaking, and that means we're focused on the lawmaking part of legislative tasks. So we're setting aside other important work like oversight, like constituency services, like some of the communications tasks.
Fundraising. Social media likes.
many things that a lawmaker goes through. But we're focused on an essential task, and that is lawmaking. And we've generated this legislative effectiveness score. We initially did so for Congress, and the idea is that we're looking at the bills that each member of, in this case, Congress sponsors. How many bills do they put forward? How far do they move through the lawmaking process? Do they get some attention in committee? Do they make it to the floor? Do they pass and become law? We downgrade the commemoratives. Congress is known for naming post offices, known for National Ice Cream Day, that sort of thing. We downgrade that, and we upgrade the substantive and significant bills, those that are truly affecting the most noteworthy issue of the day. We did that in kind of a weighted average, so if you're taking on more big issues and moving farther through the process, you get a higher score. If you're not engaged at all, you get a lower score, or if you're only interested in some of those commemoratives, a lower score. Now, we're agnostic about whether those bills are deregulation and shrinking the size of government or more regulation and growing the size of government. And from that perspective, when we first looked at members of Congress over 40 years, we found that the average Democrat and the average Republican were putting forward about the same number of bills and getting about the same score. But there were big differences in terms of who was in the majority party. Majority party members are more effective. Who was a committee chair and subcommittee chair? Who was more senior, and so on. So when we released these scores up on our website, thelawmakers.org, we said we need to set a benchmark. And that benchmark is if somebody's a seventh term committee chair in the majority party, we're expecting a lot more from them. We set a higher benchmark. We say what's the average for somebody in that position, and a lower benchmark for those who are in their first term in the minority party. And then relative to that benchmark, are they outperforming? Are they exceeding expectations? Are they highly effective? Or are they underperforming relative to that benchmark? Or are they just meeting expectations right near that benchmark?
So whom much is given, much is expected,
Much
right?
is
And so you
expected.
keep that into account to keep it more fair.
That's right. So
Right.
when we present the data, we're looking for those who dramatically outperform others in a similar way. And we're starting to use this formula in the state legislatures as well. Now, these scores are just the start. We're using those to say, well, what do they tell us about the patterns of highly effective lawmakers, and what could be done to cultivate legislatures on the whole that get things done that address those major public policy challenges.
I think that's what I love about this is that I wasn't really, and still not a great fan of scorecards, if you will. They can sometimes be used as a weapon, but this really is a strength fighter approach of just how do you identify those that are doing this really well. So why does the public care about this?
Some of our work is focused explicitly on the relationship between what voters say they're interested in or say they care about and the behavior and actual real-world activity of lawmakers, at least in the congressional setting. It goes without saying that there's a strong public perception that we're living in a period of time that's slightly politically contentious, and to some degree this might trickle down to a representative institution such that people have concerns about dysfunction either in the legislative and or executive branches. That being said, what we found in our own research is when surveyed, average members of the voting public, so these are actual voters, they express quite a strong sense of concern for effective governing. And they also put a high premium on the extent to which their legislators are effective lawmakers, at least as we define them, or define effective lawmaking. I mean, so much so that we've actually found in our own work that this concern or desire for effective lawmaking actually transcends party lines. And by that I mean, if you are a voter, all else equal, you would still want your elected official to be an effective lawmaker, even if she's of the opposite party than you. So this is clearly something that people care about. So the extent to which we would want our elected officials to represent our interests, both substantively as well as trying to advance our interests, presumably we would want them to be effective lawmakers. We've also found that when we initially ask voters without any prompting, how effective do you deem your lawmaker to be? It perhaps isn't unsurprising, but hopefully positive, that everyone is basically average. At least the general result isn't that voters think that legislators are just completely disengaged. Yeah. But that being said, one's perceptions about how effective an individual legislator is at navigating the lawmaking process in a lot of cases is completely removed from reality.
So that's where you come in to try and inform and engage the public. So based on your research, again, not just the math, but also the qualitative research of interviewing and talking with these effective lawmakers, and then looking at the trends that you observe in those strength-based representatives that are doing this well. Let's get Stephen Covey about it. What were the 5 most effective lawmaker habits?
Looking at our congressional data, we were able to identify Congress after Congress after Congress. There was a collection of legislators who were consistently overperforming what we'd expect them to be on our metric. And these overperformers, so to speak, are the people we'd identify as essentially these highly effective rank and file members. These were people who didn't have clear institutional advantages, they weren't party leaders, but consistently within either specific issue areas or overall, they were just consistently successful at navigating the legislative process. And by considering this collection of legislators, both from their own personal histories, interviews, and the like, we backed out what we collectively refer to as these 5 habits of highly effective lawmakers. The first one is that we found in Congress, and we've also found in our discussions with a wide array of state legislators, that those legislators who cultivate a policy portfolio that's tightly tied to their own experiences or their own passion or their own personal expertise. Sometimes it might be tied back to their previous occupations. All else equal, they tend to be notably more successful at advancing bills within those areas than the areas in which they're advocating for. They might have very little experience or very little personal expertise.
So I'm looking out at our lawmakers, and many of them have backgrounds as physicians, lawyers, small business owners, educators, and so what you're saying is that helps as an advantage if they specialize, whether it's their profession or just an area of interest that they happen to become an expert on. What's the sweet spot of how much they want to propose legislation in line with their area of expertise?
No, that's a great question. So we're only starting to investigate this at the state level. But the congressional issue, what we found, bluntly speaking, is that it tends to be better to be a hedgehog than a fox. So it goes without saying, upon being elected to office, whether or not it's in Congress or in the state legislature, elected officials are pulled in multiple directions based on all their different constituency needs, as well as perhaps their own personal interests. And it might be tempting to try to pursue a policy agenda that engages with all the considerations of these external stakeholders. But our advice would be that it's probably better, all else equal, to focus your attention on one specific issue area that might comport with your own personal passion or expertise or some other matters that Craig will get to. And in the Senate, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House, what we've demonstrated is the most effective lawmakers are those that tend to specialize, such that about 40 or 50% of the bills that they introduce are concentrated in one particular policy area, and then the rest of their legislative portfolio is scattered across other areas. That being said, while it might be better to be a hedgehog than a fox, in the real world, we have a lot more foxes than hedgehogs. It's clearly the case that, at least at the congressional level, not as many senators or members of the House have been able to engage in this degree of specialization that our research would suggest would be productive.
And that specialization can come not just from expertise, but from what's going on in your district. The story I like to tell about focusing a legislative agenda around district interests is the story of Don Young, a Republican from Alaska. He was mayor of Fort Yukon. He was a member of their lower house. Then he was elected to the Alaska Senate, eventually became a member of Congress in the early 1970s, and served there for 49 years until he passed away recently. Those 49 years almost exactly overlap with what we have data on and have scored. And in 25 consecutive sessions, Don Young was above expectations. He outperformed 25 in a row above expectations, outperformed his benchmark. Now that means when he was in the minority party, when he was in the majority party, when he was a subcommittee chair, when he was very junior, when he was committee chair. In each of those instances, he was outperforming. And we had the opportunity to sit down with him a few years ago and say, how did you do it? What did you do? And the message he told us is something that we've labeled all Alaska all the time. In other words, he suggested that by talking to his constituents, he knew what their policy problems were. And if he put forward a bill, it was to address a policy problem of a constituent back in Alaska. He could tell the story of what they were struggling with. He could talk about how the policy was going to address that interest and build his coalition around that, because other people were finding, yes, similar stories, similar problems in my district as well. And then when he put forward a piece of legislation, if it worked, he was able to say back home, well, how's it going? Are we addressing that problem or not? And that idea of being problem-focused, solutions-oriented helped him day in, day out, year in, year out, decades, get things done and be effective.
So the third item or suggestion we'd make is that it's important to be sensitive to the need to be entrepreneurial with one's positions of institutional influence, or be sensitive to positions of institutional influence. And what does that mean in layperson's terms? Once again, another example or story we could draw on is that of former member of Congress, Barney Frank. So many of you in the room who might be familiar with Representative Frank, the reason why we like to highlight him is, by his own admission, he's very much a proud liberal. So it's important to note that these lessons that we're putting up here don't necessarily just apply to people who identify as ideological centrists. Don Young identified himself as being pretty conservative on a variety of issues, and this lesson that Craig alluded to worked very well for him. With respect to Representative Frank, we also had the opportunity to sit down with Congressman Frank at Vanderbilt University several years ago, and he described his evolution of his understanding of the legislative process from his days in the Massachusetts State House through his very early days in Congress. And he argued that one of the most important things that a newly elected legislator, whether or not it's in the State House or in Congress, needs to recognize is that there are people in institutional positions of influence, and in this case he was thinking about committee and subcommittee chairs, and it's incumbent upon newly elected members, and especially members within the minority party, to try to find some arrangement of interests that resonates with your core constituencies, that the people who sit in these institutional positions of influence care about. So you're willing essentially to trade off on policy considerations, and to recognize that even if you're in the minority party, you should be able to find some core points of interest that resonate with your constituencies that have broad enough appeal that committee chairs, subcommittee chairs, and the like are willing to extend you an olive branch and carry water for you because it's also within their interests as well. And it's very important to be very proactive from day one upon the beginning of the session to reach out and try to cultivate these relationships.
And I'll make one brief because Alan's already mentioned it, and that is the idea of being open to compromise, even with those who are not natural allies. That could mean a variety of things, but in today's day and age, that often means bipartisanship. And when we look in Congress, the way we were able to judge how bipartisan is someone is, do they go through the effort of attracting co-sponsors to their own legislation who are from the other political party? And our data are showing that those who engage in more bipartisan co-sponsorship, attracting others to their bills, are much more highly effective according to our metric. That feels really natural if you're in the minority party, right? You can't get something done without majority party support. But we found the exact same patterns hold for members of the majority party. By reaching out across party lines, by refining their legislation to make them more palatable to the other side, kind of carving off the rough edges, the legislation is more likely to move forward. And there's a lot of research, not that we've done, but that political scientists have done, that says those are the compromises that last the longest. They're not overturned as likely by the courts. They're not overturned as likely by future lawmakers. And now we're exploring the states, and we're starting to find the exact same patterns.
So having said that, the final lesson I want to highlight refers to the ways in which incumbent legislators try to build out their coalitions. And the final habit we'd like to highlight is the importance of trying to cultivate a broad set of allies, including those outside of one's parent chamber. So one of the illustrations that we like to point to is current incumbent United States Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, who before he was U.S. Senator was U.S. member of the House of Representatives, and before that was a member of the Michigan State House. And in talking with Senator Peters about his legislative style, it's very important that he's highlighted that all of his success that he's experienced really dates back to the lessons he learned in the Michigan State Legislature and the importance of being very proactive and cognizant of the need to recognize that just because you have something pass your chamber doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere unless you've actually cultivated support outside of the parent chamber such that it could pass the other chamber as well as being signed into law by the governor. And while some people might view this as just one more hurdle that you need to overcome when you're trying to advance your legislative agenda, he actually viewed this from a position of comparative strength, recognizing that if he could cultivate a network of allies very early in the legislative process, this actually leads to a broader based and more ideologically diffuse coalition, such that it's more likely that he could navigate potential problems of the legislative or the lawmaking process early on so that he wouldn't run into roadblocks later on. And in thinking about Gary Peters, the reason why we like to highlight him is some of you in the room who might be familiar with our work. Senator Peters in the last couple of Congresses was the most highly effective Democratic lawmaker in the U.S. Senate. But it's particularly interesting that he was the most effective lawmaker in the U.S. Senate when the Democrats were in the minority, which in the 50 years that we have data on, that had never happened before. So he was the most effective senator when he was in the minority, when he was in the majority, and he has this continued pattern of effective lawmaking that he largely says builds out on lessons he was able to witness firsthand during his time in the Michigan State House.
Have you researched or looked at the relationship between the executive branch and state legislatures?
What our research demonstrates, thinking about the states, is those states in which we are able to witness cases of divided government. The extent to which we have divided government, even though it can contribute to gridlock from time to time, it can also pave the way for meaningful long-term compromises among the majority and minority party that represents a much wider array of constituencies and stakeholders than what might occur under unified government. And as Craig noted, there's quite a bit of political science research that suggests that policy production in which there's meaningful bipartisan compromise yields outcomes that are much more robust and last longer.
You also look at just overall patterns and how states compare to one another and trends over time. Can you tell us what it is that we're looking at when you look at the state of Nevada and some other observations about our silver state?
Sure. So this picture right here is presenting for over the last 30 years, essentially, from 1995 up until the early 2020s, essentially the average ideology or the median ideology in the chamber of Republican and Democratic lawmakers. And these are based on voting patterns. And what we could see is that from 1995 up until really 2013, 2015, the parties were reasonably close to each other, but there's been a recent uptick in terms of political polarization, at least as measured by voting patterns. Another way of thinking about this is over the last couple of sessions, we see a situation in which Republicans are systematically voting different than Democrats. There's notably less overlap than there was only 20, 25 years ago.
So we can see how this plays out in terms of lawmaking based on our formulas. In particular, we're interested in seeing, what is the average legislative effectiveness score for a member of the majority party or from a member of the minority party. And back in the 1990s and early 2000s in Nevada, that gap between the average effectiveness of the majority party and the minority party was among the smallest in the nation. In other words, this was the most collaborative state in the nation in terms of minority party members' bills getting an equal consideration with majority party members' bills, and again, that sort of district and problem-solving basis to move policies forward. Over the past 2 decades, that still occurs sometimes, but we're also seeing patterns of a divide between the majority party and the minority party in their average effectiveness, a divide that's matching much of the rest of the country. And it feels to us, we're outside the state, we're just looking at the data, but it feels to us that you all are at a fork in the road. There is a history of collaboration, of having the best ideas come from anywhere, not thinking all of the best ideas come from just the majority party, to not having that. And as you're thinking about moving forward, one of those models or the other could take hold here as we move forward.
So with that, I'd like to open it up to our question and answer time. Have you seen higher effectiveness scores in certain policy areas?
So in Congress, we break it down by policy area. There are some areas that are very gridlocked. Many of the issues that women are more likely to sponsor bills on than men are more gridlocked. Maybe because the committee chairs are men and they're not as interested in those issues as consistently. So there's some of that pattern. But there's also a trend in Congress now which has its upside and downside, which is instead of passing individual standalone bills, they're cobbling a bunch of things together in these omnibus packages, big budget deals, big National Defense Authorization Act, Farm Bill, and so on. And you would think that if it's a National Defense Authorization Act, it'll be defense policy. And if you would think if it's a farm bill, it'll be farm policy. But the nature of these let's cobble together things has allowed some of these most gridlocked areas to be addressed kind of behind the scenes. What we've looked at, though, are who are the people that are effective as lawmakers in getting their bills attached to other legislative vehicles. And it turns out to be the same set of skills and the same individuals who are active and effective at standalone legislation, are active and effective in finding other pathways to move their bills forward.
For all intents and purposes, it's important to recognize for every bill that's introduced, there's clearly some stakeholder behind it. Someone cares about it. And more often than not, it's more than one someone. So in these cases, just trying to put something into the hopper and move it forward, elected officials are doing their best to represent the interests of their constituents. Now, as to whether or not the legislation itself is effective or ineffective, one point to note is another habit, even though it wasn't highlighted here, but another habit that I think we could highlight in our conversations with incumbent and former members of Congress is that some of the most effective lawmakers recognize that some of the most meaningful policy change is incremental in nature. And by that I mean a bill is passed and then a little bit of time passes before the effects and obvious consequences of the legislation is revealed that leads to corrections or adjustments in response to constituency needs. And the most effective lawmakers, at least some of them who we talked to, were very cognizant of that and recognize that it's incumbent upon them to be responsive to the feedback they receive from their constituents such that they could actively tweak legislation or do their best to tweak legislation in real time to move hopefully from quote unquote ineffective legislation to effective policy outcomes.
And to follow it beyond it didn't stop when they made the law.
It's important to follow up and make sure it gets implemented, that it's not just about passing that legislation. I also appreciate that we've got a pretty strong libertarian streak, even on both sides of the aisle in this state, and that you acknowledge that sometimes it's about passing laws that do add to and other laws that, you know, remove from and clean things up. So there's a place for both. So can you leave us with some final encouragement?
Well, I guess what I would say is, you know, building on some of the earlier points, it's very easy to get cynical or discouraged or panic-ridden in various ways, depending on what news you're tuned into or perhaps not tuned into. You know, I think if there's a couple of takeaways from what Craig and I have been describing. One is there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that there are strategies that can be employed and tools that can be employed to help elected officials advance their legislative agendas. And this applies to Congress, this applies to state legislatures, it applies whether or not someone is the minority party or the majority party. And it goes without saying that certain people's or certain persons and where they sit in the chamber is going to influence the scope of their opportunities. But it also goes without saying that we could point to numerous members of Congress, members of state houses and the like, that simply speaking have really transcended their institutional positions to be successful and effective lawmakers, to advance the interests of their constituents in a way that's consistent with their wishes. And related to that, I think it also goes without saying that to those of you who currently serve or served in the past, and for those of you who aren't elected officials yet, I think we all owe quite a bit of gratitude to these people. I think at the end of the day, regardless of your party affiliation, your ideology, your policy goals, it's important to be cognizant of the fact that to put yourself out there in front of fellow citizens and ask for their vote and ask to represent them, especially in these times, takes a lot of courage and a lot of grit. And to show up to work day after day, especially in a state like Nevada, where they are taking away time from their personal and professional lives, as Jill noted, this is a really substantial ask, and it takes a lot for people to be dedicated in this way. And so I know Craig and I, we thank you for being willing to talk to us, but we also thank you for your service, and we're excited to see where Nevada goes in the future. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
I think send a note not just of complaints of what's going wrong, but a note of thanks for your service, and we're heartfelt in our thanks as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. The Gallagher Dialogues are named in honor of one of the Guinn Center's founding members, Tom Gallagher, who strongly believed in the power of bipartisanship and the free exchange of ideas. It was a truly impactful night, bringing together the governor, executive branch, legislators from both sides of the aisle, and community members to focus on how to work better together for the good of Nevada. I hope you found what Craig Volden and Alan Wiseman had to tell us as fascinating as I did. Thank you for joining me for the Guinn Center's Gallagher Dialogues.